So my talk today, you may have noticed, doesn't quite correspond to what was in the program. I'm sorry. It just didn't, as writing it just didn't turn into what I thought it would be. So, all right, so here we go. Many Catholics discussing the proper use of, so what I'm going to talk about today is basically power. I want to talk about just the sort of problem of power. So many Catholics discussing the proper use of political power in relation to the common good overlook the fundamental problems concerning political power itself. What power is, how it works, the forms power can take under which circumstances, how the reality of power relates to the reality of the social order in which it operates, etc. These fundamental questions about power are simultaneously at the heart of classical political theory. Plato and Aristotle addressed the problem of power by focusing on the intrinsic relationship between the moral composition of the people and the type of regime. It's this intrinsic relationship that I want to reflect on. It is a central feature of pre-modern classical political thought. Within the classical reading, any given positive regime comes to be and is sustained only within a social regime, a way that the people are. As Plato asserted, quote, "There must be as many types of individual as of society. Societies aren't made of sticks and stones, but of men, whose individual characters, by turning the scale one way or another, determine the direction of the whole," end quote. This is not, however, because culture is upstream of politics, as the saying goes, nor because politics is actually upstream of culture. It is because human beings are at the same time social and ethical. Our societies are essentially moral, and our morals are essentially social. Political theory, therefore, must not first address the question, how should power be used? Rather, it must first address the questions about the nature of power. A first step in this direction is the recognition that different forms of power are integral to different social circumstances, precisely what pre-modern theorists like Plato and Aristotle did. When we say power, we mean efficacy. If we mean efficacy, if we mean the ability of one man to affect change in the behavior of another man, then power is always a middle term between at least two persons. In other words, power exists in certain forms in certain circumstances that it does not in other circumstances. And so a mode of acting that is powerless in one setting is powerful in another. The power of the tyrant is not the same sort of thing as the power of the king. The two forms of power share the concept of efficacy, but this is a shallow and bare sort of univocity, because their efficacy does not work in the same sort of way. They are not experienced in the same sort of way. They are not aimed at the same sort of ends. They simply are not the same thing. It is not that the king declines to use the tactics of the tyrant, though he could. It is that the means of a tyrant are not efficacious in a kingdom, just as the means of kingship are not efficacious in a tyranny. Kingdoms are regimes in which royal power is efficacious. Tyrannies are regimes in which tyrannical power is efficacious. Political philosophy, classically understood, is the attempt to understand not a bare univocal notion of power, but these actual various powers of regime. Hence, the classical political thinker is obsessed with types of regimes. Notice that not only do the ends change as we transition from one regime to another, but the means change. It is not that different means are used as others are set aside. It is rather that the full battery of available means shifts. Political theorists of the 17th century abandoned the classical task of understanding the differing powers that types of actual regimes wield, and so, in my view, amount to variations of the reason of state politics launched by Machiavelli and perfected by Thomas Hobbes. These modern so-called sciences of power cannot be counted as variations or innovations of classical political science, because the regime question was abandoned from the outset. The essence of the classical conception of political power was altogether ignored. Politics becomes, for the modern political theorist, merely the mechanics of the only regime that they deemed possible, the tyrannical regime. All regimes are tyrannical regimes. That is, regimes composed of atomized and self-interested subjects that are extrinsically bound together through impersonal power. This one regime allows for all sorts of disagreements all sorts of disagreements on details and strategy. What is the most effective constitution? What constitutional arrangement contributes to the most happiness? What contributes to the most wealth? What contributes to the strongest military? What maximizes power and what leads to its decline? Indeed, what constitution does God want us to have? The proliferation of political arguments on these and many more questions resembled political philosophy, but such theorists were partisans within a more fundamentally unquestioned regime. They fought a lot about constitutions, but no longer about regimes. This is why power itself became simple and uncomplicated. It was always more or less the same. Classically, of course, regimes were divided into two broad categories: just regimes and unjust regimes. St. Thomas, following directly St. Augustine, divided human mastery over other humans into two types. One was rule for the common good, and the other was rule for the good of the one who ruled. The first type we can refer to as royal, and the second as tyrannical. The primary distinction between the two is, as the stranger in Plato's Statesman articulates, quote, "And it is no doubt the case that we are to address as a tyrannical art the care of those who submit to force, and as the political art the voluntary herd grooming of voluntary two-footed animals, and declare that he who has this as an art and care is in his being king and statesman," end quote. Similarly, Aristotle wrote, quote, "For kings rule according to law over voluntary subjects, but tyrants over involuntary. And so the one are guarded by their fellow citizens, and the others are guarded against them," end quote. Royal power is found in free obedience. But why would one not motivated through fear of punishment or promise of reward obey his king? The answer, of course, is that the subject's end and the king's end are the same, and that the subject trusts in the king's superior judgment in the pursuit of that common good, which we might call happiness. But we cannot understand this condition as something that descends from above. We cannot suppose that the king uses his power to somehow extrinsically instill in the subject a desire for the common good and a trust in his leadership. This would be to go back to the beginning of the problem of power before we made any progress at all. Rather, to understand obedience, we must, following Aristotle, start not with the kingdom, but with the smallest of societies, the friendship. Mankind is social in his nature, and his end is happiness. This means that happiness is had together, or it is not had at all. What makes a man happy is a participation in the happy life of another person, to love another for who he is, and to be loved by that person as himself, to have friends. Of course, man also has material needs, food and shelter and what have you. The combination of friendship with the satisfaction of material needs is what constitutes the family. The family, then, emerges naturally out of man's shared desire for happiness, and the family achieves this common good. But the happiness of a lonely family is an imperfect happiness, not because it is flawed, but because it is the very nature of happiness to seek its own deepening. Happiness includes essentially a desire for a more perfect happiness. Happy families seek to deepen their happiness by integrating into each other to form what we might call higher levels of order. The common good, the shared happiness of friends, is deepened in its elevation into greater order. This is very practical. Friends need shared projects in which they can serve each other. Friends need shared loves through which they can appreciate each other's accomplishments and contributions. At the very least, friends need something to talk about. The more, the better. Aristotle and St. Thomas following him explain that out of friends' discourses, out of their conversations concerning true and false, just and unjust, useful and unuseful, there emerges first households and then cities. St. Thomas further explains that men's desire to know the truth of things is itself a social endeavor, with each person sharing in conversation the truth he knows and receiving the truth that his friend knows. In such social reasoning, each person comes to know within a socialized world what has already been within a socialized world that has already been reasoned and discussed into existence. He doesn't start from scratch, but starts in a dynamic stream of discursive truth and participates in that stream. Within the stream, he understands more, and so he can discuss more, and so he can participate more efficaciously in the movement of this shared world deeper into the common good. The friends' shared space of communication becomes richer and more beautiful as more is integrated into it, more knowledge, more experience, more personalities, more truth. Part of the experience of happiness is to strive in hope after more perfect happiness. A higher level of order, a more perfect living of the common good, is a more perfect object of man's natural desire for happiness, and so is, so to speak, more diffusive of its good exactly because it is desired more. As Thomas put it, referencing Dionysius' divine names, quote, "Wherefore it is said by some, not without reason, that good as such is self-diffusive, because the better a thing is, the further does the outpouring of its goodness extend," end quote. This pursuit of the higher order common good can never be construed as somehow subordinating or leaving behind the lower levels of society. It is the exact opposite. The higher good is more diffusive precisely because the lower levels desire it as themselves. Friends desire more perfect friendship. As Aquinas writes, quote, "Everything desires the perfection of that which it wills and loves for its own sake, because whatever we love for its own sake, we wish to be best and ever to be bettered and multiplied as much as possible," end quote. The friend that one loves for his own sake, then, includes the social project, the social movement in which that particular friendship subsists. A man loves his wife when it is just the two of them enjoying the joys of youth, and that love drives them to push beyond themselves by starting a family. And of course, the man comes to love her more perfectly when she is not only his wife, but the mother of his children. She now is her integration into the family, and so the friendship with her husband now is a familial friendship, not extrinsically, not in some sort of stacking of associations, but intrinsically. As a friendship is integrated into higher levels of order, its shared space is deepened, the common good is richer. But what is important to see is that this deepening is a deepening of the smallest thing, friendship, because happiness can only finally be real in actual human relationships. As Aristotle explains, quote, "It is clear then that a state is not a mere society having a common place established for the prevention of mutual crime and for the sake of exchange. These are conditions without which a state cannot exist, but all of them together do not constitute a state, which is a community of families and aggregations of families in well-being for the sake of a perfect and self-sufficing life. Hence, arise in cities family connections, brotherhoods, common sacrifices, amusements which draw men together. But these are created by friendship, for friendship is the motive of social life. The end of the state is the good life, and these are the means toward it," end quote. The common good is always in the concrete the good of real, immediate relationships. The point, though, is that it is the very nature of the common good that the desire for it results in the integration of smaller participations in that common good into higher or more noble participations. It is pursued through the pursuit of ever further unity of order, which is a movement not from the deficient to the sufficient, but from the imperfect to the perfect, like a boy becoming a man. Discussion of the relationship between parts and wholes can sometimes confuse us here. There are parts of wholes that are such that, that as Thomas explains, quote, "There is no operation of the part that does not belong to the whole," end quote. For example, a hand is a part of the body in such a way that the hand does nothing that is not more exactly the action of the body. The hand is instrumental for the body, hence the willingness to sacrifice the hand in order to protect the body. This is not the kind of parts-whole dynamic that characterizes a political society, however. As Thomas explains, quote, "It must be known, moreover, that the whole which the political group or the family constitutes has only a unity of order, for it is not something absolutely one," end quote. A unity of order is characterized by a shared end, and in the pursuit of that end, ordered relationships between parts are necessary. In the case of men, the shared end, in fact, is harmony, is social happiness. The unity of end for man as a social animal is the construction of unity between parts, is the construction of and living in peace. But these parts at peace are never merely parts of a whole, like a hand to a body. Rather, the individual, the family, and the city are wholes in their own right, even as those wholes are in integral relationship to each other as ordered to a common end. Their relationality is an aspect of their integrity. Their status of parts is an aspect of who they are as wholes. St. Thomas compares this social order repeatedly to the order of the universe. The universe is, of course, composed of beings that have being in their participation in the goodness of the goodness of the Creator, and who therefore seek perfection in a return to the superabundant source. They are ordered first and most importantly through the shared end. But as Thomas explains, goodness is self-diffusive. Goodness is the imparting of goodness to others. The universe, therefore, participates in the good more perfectly through each thing's diffusing of goodness to others as the manner in which the goodness of the whole is ordered toward the common end. God's perfect rule of the universe, then, is a rule that occurs not against or extrinsic to the natures of creation, but rather is those natures. The parts of the universe are most perfectly wholes exactly as parts. As St. Thomas writes of this cosmic order, quote, "We have an example of this in civil affairs, for there is a certain order among all the members of a household according as they are subject to the head of the house. Again, the head of the house, together with all the other heads of houses in the same city, have a certain order among themselves and in relation to the governor of the city. And he again, together with all the other governors in a kingdom, is subordinate to the king," end quote. The king rules within the polity. He perfects the polity through guiding each and all of the parts as smaller orders, as wholes and of themselves, into deeper participation in the greater order. His office is to combine ever more perfectly the smaller participations in the common good into deeper participations through the unity of order. This rule is efficacious precisely because these parts desire deeper unity. The king's utterances of truth are made to a society that wants to hear them. This does not mean that he tells them things that they already know. Rather, it is the nature of smaller instances of social order to desire to go beyond themselves into the unknown, into that which they do not already possess or even comprehend. Royal power, then, rules through the trust that is born of hope. The ruler truly rules, truly guides the ruled deeper into the common good in surprising ways. The movement to a higher level of unity requires this initiative from above. The king's power is authority, efficacious through obedience, a dynamic that exists only within a shared experience of truth and goodness. This is what it means to rule through law. Law is, in St. Thomas's most succinct definition, an external principle of human action for the good. Human action is, of course, rational and voluntary. Law, then, is an external principle of rational and free action. What I want to suggest here is that within the classical understanding of monarchy, such law emerges as a means by which communities of the common good are elevated into each other and so to a higher level of order. Let's take, for example, two just and happy and yet relatively lonely villages. The just specification of the natural law is different in the two villages, and so there is a gap between them. Their conversations about right and wrong, true and false, are isolated from each other, and yet in their very natures are reaching out, looking for more to discuss. The king's law, then, as a more general dictate of reason, comes to both villages externally and is freely received by them into their reason as if it were native to their own discourse. Proper law, then, is the middle term, we might say, between authority and obedience, and in so being connects two subjects through a third. This law externally bridges the gap between the villages, elevating their discourses on justice and truth into a now shared discourse. Just law, of course, does not trump or destroy the particular discourses of the villages. If it did, it would not be freely received as if native. Rather, it leads them beyond themselves as themselves into this new association of friends. Law's end is to bring the villages together into a deeper unity of order in which they are friends. Their now shared discourse on the law is the conversation that enables the construction of this new level of order wherein the law is no longer extrinsic but intrinsic. The king doesn't just bridge the gaps, he closes the gaps through elevating the separated parties. This is the function of true law. The ruler teaches through law, and the objective of instructing is for the pupil to be instructed. The objective is for the instruction to cease being instruction and to become rather knowledge. Excuse me. Law, then, is in its nature temporary, provisional, and imperfect. Law is fulfilled not in some habitual obedience to a proposition that remains foreign, but rather in becoming an aspect of the just and the unjust, the true and the false, that makes up an honest conversation between friends, and which builds households and cities. The king rules willing subjects through law. This is the form of his power, and it is possible only in a virtuous society. As Aristotle asserts, quote, "The virtue of the good man is necessarily the same as the virtue of the citizen of the perfect state," end quote. And again, quote, "A people who are by nature capable of producing a race superior in the virtue needed for political rule are fitted for kingly government," end quote. The movement deeper into virtue is, of course, the movement into the common good as I have described it here. From within their position in society, a virtuous people seek virtuous leaders at the same time that they seek to be virtuous leaders. As D.C. Schindler has recently wrote, quote, "The pursuit of the good will always be, in some sense, both a giving to what is other and a receiving from what is other," end quote. The virtuous look up with obedience as they look down with authority, we might say. This is what it means to be just, to render each his due. Excuse me. A virtuous society seeks the most capable and most virtuous of its members and elevates them into the position to lead society deeper into the common good at the same time as the most capable and most virtuous members voluntarily assume that position. The virtuous society is not first and then later a monarch emerges. Rather, a virtuous society is a royal society. It is ruled by kings, so to speak, at every level of scale. As St. Thomas states, quote, "The providence by which God rules things is similar to the providence by which the father of the family rules his household or a king rules a city or kingdom. The common element in these rules is the primacy of the common good over the good of the individual," end quote. In a hierarchy of associations of the common good, virtuous leadership emerges out of each level of order. This means a perfect monarchy is a perfect aristocracy, even as it is a perfect polity. This is why I think St. Thomas can at times claim that a monarchy is the best form, and yet more forcefully assert that a mixed regime is the best. For example, he asserts, quote, the best manner of constituting the ruling offices occurs in a city or region in which there is a single person who is placed in authority on the basis of virtue and presides over everyone, and in which under him there are certain others who govern in accord with virtue, and yet in which this political arrangement involves everyone, both because the rulers can be chosen from among everyone and also because they are chosen by everyone," end quote. A further implication is that in the perfect state, the positive regime and the social regime tend always towards identity. The people are the administration. The life of the people is the specification of the law from the most general to the most specific. The king's rule, like the rule of the mayor, like the rule of the father, is a rule from within social virtue and not from outside it. This is what it means for the monarch to rule according to law, that is to say, for him to be legitimate. The king is then the embodiment of society's unity, and as such, his power is absolute. When he calls on the people to act, they act in their totality, holding nothing back, because they act as themselves. The royal regime, then, is a regime of free men. There is another side to royal rule that we must mention, and that is its coercive aspect. Political leadership, as I've attempted to explain it, is about closing the gaps in society, about integrating communities of the common good into more perfect order. These gaps are, in a sense, the king's field of action. They are also regions of peril. Outside of the achieved common good, outside of friendships, is a realm of danger, a relative wilderness that is not yet subdued and over which one's order does not yet have dominion. It is where crime happens. Sometimes it is a realm of open warfare. The virtuous citizens, then, who follow the king's law beyond their communities of friends, do so with valor, not only because they venture into the unknown, but because they must do so armed against the vicious men that are likely lurking in the darkness. They must be willing to use coercion in order to clear the space. The polity coerces criminals with its law, that is true, but it is not law properly speaking to the criminal. Law is a middle term between two, between authority and obedience, and here it is one-sided. For the criminal, it is not an external principle of human action. It is an obstruction. It is a problem for him, but it is not something brought into his reasoning about the true and the false, the just and the unjust. The lawgiver coerces according to the law of the polity, but no citizen qua citizen experiences coercive law. This is perhaps a pedantic point, a matter of definition, but it does matter, because without it, we can become confused into thinking that the king's power resides in his coercion, but this is mistaken. His power, even his police and military power, is grounded in his calling the courageous out onto the field, and this is a product of his legal authority freely obeyed. There is nevertheless, in the gaps, a necessity for what we might call administration. Extrinsic rights and duties, the impersonal sorting of people into administrative units, becomes necessary exactly because in the gaps, people do not know each other as friends, as persons. Administrative methods are used, even in just societies, as an aspect of the means of closing the gaps, of stitching together imperfectly, through an order of parts to a whole, communities of the common good, and so in this sense are an aspect of attaining the greater common good achieved through unity of order. If a royal regime seeks to close gaps, a tyrannical regime seeks to open them up, seeks always greater separation. In order to understand the efficacy of tyrannical power, then, we must attend to the problem of the gaps. As we have seen, in a just society, the gaps are areas of imperfect ordering toward the common good, places where extrinsic forms must temporarily stitch together smaller wholes as parts to a greater whole. The gaps are regions where the citizens of a just regime venture out with a bit of fear, a bit of anxiety, but with courage and with trust in their ruler who calls them to greater order through law. A tyrannical order, on the other hand, seeks to set up shop in these gaps and slowly expand them. One way in which the classics expressed this was in the assertion that tyrannies always relied upon mercenaries. Mercenaries were foreign, but this does not mean that they necessarily came from a different city. What it means is that they were not true citizens of the polity because their end was not the common good. Plato explains that men who become mercenaries in a tyrannical society are nothing other than the criminals that operate in the gaps of a just society, where they had already divided their private interests from the public good. All tyrannical regimes rely upon such professionalized criminals to staff their impersonal apparatus of rule in the gaps. In an oligarchic regime, the gaps between neighborhoods and families are held open by structures of greed and fear. The first thing that must here be done is the elimination of all would-be kings, the elimination of all supremely virtuous men who through their leadership would offer an alternative to the mercenary force by calling free men as free men into the gaps. The oligarch must eliminate this competition, the oligarchs. This is not too difficult once the social regime has already began to drift into tyranny because kings rule over voluntary subjects. And so, as Aristotle remarks, quote, their overthrow is readily effected, for there is an end to the king when his subjects do not want to have him, end quote. Once this is done, the oligarchs can secure the gaps in a parts to whole order, with formal designations of different types of people who hold different rights and liabilities. Property qualifications are introduced, taxes are levied, officials are assigned, and administration is built. While operating in this newly formed public space, the man does not exist as himself, but conforms himself to the apparatus as an instrument or tool that has been designed for some end other than his own. We can clearly see the alienation that is a part of such a regime. The just father wants the good of his family, and this includes wanting to deepen that good through integration into increased levels of order. But before he ventures outside into the gaps in trust and risk, he must secure what is under his own authority inside. When what is outside is a threat to what is inside, he will always choose what is inside. This is merely an aspect of his justice, of his royal rule. When he perceives that what is larger, what is outside, is not conducive to the good of what is smaller, what is inside, a just man will not sacrifice for the higher level of order. Rather, he will either fight it or make deals with it. If the tyranny is clever, in time he will learn that the man will learn he can bring home certain goods from without if he haggles with the regime of the gaps. But this working on the outside is always ordered down and into the newly created private sphere. He becomes willing to play a part in public, willing to take on abstract offices and roles, willing to assert rights and fulfill duties that he does not in any way own or owe as a person, but merely as a cog in the mechanism. He is willing to flatter the power, to become bad, to become just another mercenary. Aristotle remarks, quote, "Hence tyrants are always fond of bad men, because they love to be flattered, and no one who has the spirit of a free man in him will lower himself to flattery," end quote. This is the alienation that underwrites the power in tyrannical regimes. It is the origin of the public-private distinction. The man becomes turned against himself, inverting the royal order by seeking a private good outside in order to build and maintain a common good inside his family. In the pursuit of the good, he quite literally serves in the mechanism that frustrates his achievement of a more perfect good. This is the construction of social vice. The tyranny subsists in a society of little tyrants who, as Plato has Socrates explained, quote, "pass their lives without a friend in the world. They are always either master or slave and never taste true friendship or freedom," end quote. Tyranny can be neither rule by free men nor rule over free men. Indeed, Aristotle goes so far as to assert that no free man will endure a tyranny. This ought to be read as a definition of what it means to be free. The tyrannical subject's soul becomes as disordered as the city in which he participates. As it does, as he becomes more self-interested, the power in the gaps becomes stronger and so ambitious to expand. This is the move into democracy, which is the extension of the gaps into the realm of family and intimate relationships, intimate friendships. Plato explains it as a form of patricide, where the individualist turns on the family, the very community of the common good that gave him life. The impersonal formal regime of the gaps is extended to every individual in all his interactions. Each person becomes a person only to himself, a friend only to himself, viewing all others as potentially useful as instruments. Politics as the pursuit of the common good ceases to exist. Everything outside the individual is in the gaps, where people are ordered not to a shared end, but merely as parts to a whole. As Aristotle states, quote, "Virtue must be the care of a state which is truly so called, and not merely enjoys the name. For without this end, the community becomes a mere alliance, which differs only in place from alliances of which the members live apart. And law is only a convention, and has no real power to make the citizens good and just." This is a situation of ultimate moral disorder, where each individual views the rest only within his pursuit of whatever passion happens to dominate in his disordered soul. Inevitably, an alliance will form under the leadership of a demagogue who is nothing more than the best flatterer. This alliance will be aimed at using all those who are not members of it. What this means is that it is always an alliance of the one and the many against the few, a complete repudiation of the hierarchical ordering of a just society. The demagogue, who soon becomes an outright tyrant, sets about eliminating all remnants of friendship, all lingering centers of strength and virtue, that he might extend his structure of rational administration down and through the whole. The prudent tyrant, Aristotle explains, quote, "must put to death men of spirit. He must not allow common meals, clubs, education, and the like. He must be upon his guard against anything which is likely to inspire either courage or confidence among his subjects. He must prohibit literary assemblies or other meetings for discussion. He must take every means to prevent people from knowing one another, for acquaintance begets mutual confidence. He sows quarrels among the citizens. Friends should be embroiled with friends, the people with the notables, and the rich with one another," end quote. Indeed, the tyranny can maintain and extend its power only through the destruction of any royal power that might still exist or come to be formed, down and through the whole. For, in the words of Aristotle, quote, "a tyrant is not overthrown until men begin to have confidence in one another. And this is the reason why tyrants are at war with the good. They are under the idea that their power is endangered by them, not only because they will not be ruled despotically, but also because they are loyal to one another and to other men, and do not inform against one another or against other men," end quote. Here we experience the ultimate level of alienation, where all that is left of a free man is a kernel of individual consciousness. Each person is in his soul alone before the mass, organized as a structure of instrumental parts, making up a single whole, of which he is, in all his outside movements, merely a part, a mercenary ruled by mercenaries. In the inevitable movement from democracy to outright tyranny, Plato explains, quote, "the people find, as the saying is, that they've jumped out of the frying pan of subjection to free men into the fire of subjection to slaves, and exchanged their excessive and untimely freedom for the harshest and bitterest of servitudes, where the slave is master." End quote. In the end, even the tyrant succumbs to the strength of the mechanism of universal slavery and fears it as much as does anyone else. The whole functions only on the reality of vice and despair, only on the atomization of the population, and so the maximization of their anxiety. Terrified and alone, as Hannah Arendt described in her explanation of the rise of 20th century totalitarianism, the individual will believe anything and will do anything for some degree of safety and belonging. Miserable and yet driven by human nature to seek happiness through social belonging, this sad soul will seek it in total submission, in which he works to build the very structure of alienation and fear that holds him in bondage. We can see, I think, how monarchy and tyranny are the regimes furthest away from each other, not just in some sort of moral worth, but in actual structural characteristics. A royal regime is a mixed form, where the rule of the people and the rule of the king merge together into a single regime of friendship and trust, of authority and obedience. Kingship can only exist where friendship exists. Tyranny, on the other hand, cannot exist where there is friendship. Its foundations are in the gaps, and it moves to eliminate internalized unity and to replace it with administration. It seeks to separate, to replace the unity of virtue with the division of vice. Tyranny combines separated people through impersonal mechanisms, through an order of parts to a whole, wherein the movement of any part is the movement of the whole, like a body and its hand. The king rules voluntary subjects through law. The tyrant rules involuntary subjects through a parody of law that we might call an administrative state or a bureaucracy, a military-style organization personified in the mercenaries. The royal regime rests on authority met with obedience that is found only in a virtuous people. The tyrannical rests on a raw power met with submission found only in a vicious people. Friendship always and everywhere works against tyranny because friends are willing to sacrifice for each other's good and are completely unwilling to sacrifice their friends' good for the ends proposed by an unjust regime. A father is simply wicked if he sends his son off to fight for a regime that is not integral to the achieved good of the family. To sacrifice one's friend for an unjust regime or for a foreign regime is unjust. A just man, rather, will send his son to fight alongside the sons of his friends against the unjust regime. A just man and his friends will defend the highest level of society ordered to the common good, whether that be the family, the neighborhood, the city, or the nation, which is to say that he will fight always for the perfection of the good of the level of order over which he has authority, the level of his friends. The tyranny, then, can only exist exactly where friendship does not exist. It must push friendship out and replace it with an order in which each man, in seeking his own end, views the other parts of the mechanism in which he is as mere parts, expendable and replaceable, as mere slaves worthy of being sacrificed for the power and efficacy of the whole. The final tyrannical move is when the man turns the part of him that is merely an instrument against the part of him that is still deep down a person, when within a man the slave sacrifices the free man to the whole. This is, of course, a form of suicide. I'd like to end by bringing things back to the 17th century. Everyone begins with Machiavelli, and not without reason. The most important move made by him for my purposes here is the move toward a univocal understanding of power. The only power Machiavelli is interested in is the sort of power that exists in tyrannies, the power of promises and threats. Because of this, his focus becomes strategies of how one builds, sustains, and maximizes power. He is close enough to the classical tradition, however, to have a sense of what he is doing. He is close enough, I think, to know that royal power of free men is possible. For example, his obsession with appearances, with tricking the people into thinking that the prince has virtue, betrays his lingering classical approach. As Aristotle and Xenophon had suggested, exactly because of the truth of royal power, the smartest tyrant acts in such a way as to be mistaken, at least superficially, for a king. The so-called reason of state tradition that developed out of Machiavelli's thought steadily minimized the credibility of true royal power. Giovanni Botero is sometimes invoked by statist Catholics such as Adrian Vermeule and Gladden Papin as a thinker who initiated a strand of this tradition compatible with Christianity. But this is, I think, mistaken. Rather, what Botero does is move Christianity into Machiavelli's reason of state logic. As he explains, quote, "But of all the laws, none is more favorable to princes than the Christian, because it submits to them not only the bodies and faculties of subjects, where this is appropriate, but the souls and consciences as well. And it binds not only the hands, but even the affections and thoughts. And it prescribes that obedience be given to wicked princes as well as ordinary ones, and that everything be endured in order not to disturb the peace. A prince then should promote Christianity, because the more the subjects will be accustomed to and fervent in the ways of God, so much the more manageable and obedient will they be to their prince," end quote. We need not attribute to Botero Machiavelli's cynicism. Rather, I think his sincerity is the development worth noting. For Botero, Christianity is true, and so it works the best in the construction of a centralized, essentially Machiavellian state. Machiavelli was mistaken for Botero because he did not understand just how useful Christianity was to power, and this usefulness is ultimately indistinguishable from its veracity. This is why Botero can follow Machiavelli in advocating one mode of tyrannical power after the next, advancing a systemic program for eliminating all rival nodes of power in a society. Botero goes beyond the classical understanding of tyranny by introducing Christianity as what amounts to the ideological component of maximizing power. All the tactics of the tyrant are therefore available to the Christian ruler. Tyrannical power works just fine in Botero's regime because, quote, "the end of the resources of a prince is the preservation and expansion of the state," end quote. In order for him to do this most effectively, the prince must be a Christian. It is not enough to fake it. He must actually believe it. Only in this way will he gain in reputation, and reputation is, for Botero, the most important characteristic of the prince. Indeed, reputation is the solution to Machiavelli's dilemma of whether it is better to be loved or feared. For as Botero explains, quote, "reputation is composed of love and fear, which is better than the one or the other because it contains that which is good and useful in both. That is, it takes from love the union of the subjects with the prince, and from fear the submission. But someone will ask me, which of the greater parts in reputation, love or which is the greater part, love or fear? Fear without a doubt, because just as respect and reverence are also reputation, because just as in respect and reverence, so also in reputation is for the eminence of virtue, from which proceeds species of fear rather than love. This can be easily understood by this. Love is a passion that conciliates spirits. Fear draws them back. The former unites, the latter draws them apart. The former makes equal, the latter makes unequal. Now it is clear that in reputation there appear many more features and effects of fear than of love, because it has greater strength to pull back, to separate, and to render unequal," end quote. Botero is a missing link between Machiavelli's straight tyranny and the complete forgetting of royal power that is characterized by political theories of the 17th century. In Botero, ethics... okay, sorry. I'm done. In Botero, ethics returns to politics only it is now a version that operates entirely within the tyrannical form. Those conversations between friends concerning the just and the unjust, the true and the false, that the classical tradition understood to be how just politics, how shared social worlds were built in the pursuit of the common good, are now replaced with ideology, with a truth that is no longer a discursive process of building a shared world, but is rather a propositional decree, a social world that is compelled from above, that is to be believed and lived in if one wants to avoid punishment and receive rewards. Botero's is a more perfect tyranny. So I'll skip some here. But I was just going to say that this is the case with Locke and absolutists and stuff as well, but anyway, we can skip that. The imperative of our current moment is to regain a classical view of politics, to regain a belief in the possibility of an actual political form to a just society. This is a tradition that has never actually died. It has just become marginalized and mocked by the serious people, by the realists, by the politicals, as they were known in the 17th century. We need to regain control of this tradition. That's it.